The Camper's Nightmare. In the summer of 2002, a group of friends set out on a camping trip in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, hiking, and relaxation, but it quickly turned into a nightmare they would never forget. On their first night, as they sat around the campfire, they heard strange noises coming from the woods, heavy footsteps, the cracking of branches, and an eerie low growl that sent chills down their spines. At first, they dismissed it as a bear or some other wild animal, but as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer and more menacing. Around midnight, one of the campers, Steve, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the darkness, despite the protests of his friends. He had only been gone a few minutes when they heard a blood-curdling scream. The others rushed to find him, but all they found was his flashlight, lying broken on the ground, and huge human-like footprints leading deeper into the forest. They searched for Steve all night, but it wasn't until dawn that they found him, alive but traumatized. He was huddled under a tree, shaking uncontrollably, and his clothes were torn as if he'd been in a struggle. Steve refused to speak about what had happened, but the look of sheer terror in his eyes told them all they needed to know. They packed up and left the campsite immediately, vowing never to return. The Lone Hiker's Terror. In the fall of 2010, an experienced hiker named Sarah decided to tackle a remote trail in the Sierra Nevada mountains. She was no stranger to the wilderness and often hiked alone, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of nature. But this hike would be unlike any she had ever experienced. As she made her way up the mountain, Sarah noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her skin crawl. Then she heard it, a loud, guttural roar that echoed through the trees. It was unlike any animal she had ever heard, and it filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Sarah quickened her pace, hoping to reach her campsite before dark, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. She glanced over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. A dark, hairy figure, at least 8 feet tall, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Panic set in, and Sarah began to run, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind her, gaining on her with every second. Desperate, she scrambled up a rocky incline and found a small cave to hide in. She huddled in the darkness, clutching her knife, and prayed that the creature would pass her by. For hours, Sarah sat in the cave, listening to the creature's heavy breathing and the sound of its massive feet moving outside. At one point, it came so close she could see its shadow cast against the cave wall. But just when she thought it would find her, the creature let out a deafening roar and retreated into the forest. When dawn finally broke, Sarah cautiously emerged from the cave and made her way back down the mountain, her nerves frayed and her body exhausted. She never told anyone about her encounter, fearing they would think she was crazy, but she never hiked alone again. The Hunter's Encounter. In the winter of 1997, 2 seasoned hunters, Mike and Tom, ventured into the remote forests of British Columbia in search of game. The area was known for its dense woods and abundant wildlife, but it was also known for something else: strange sightings of a creature that locals referred to as Sasquatch. The hunters had always dismissed the stories as nonsense, until one fateful evening when they came face to face with the legend itself. They had set up camp near a frozen lake and were sitting around the fire when they heard a series of loud knocks, like someone banging on a tree with a heavy object. The sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from the other side of the lake. Curious, Mike grabbed his rifle and motioned for Tom to follow him. They crossed the lake and made their way toward the sound, their breath visible in the cold night air. As they approached the source of the noise, they were hit with a foul, musky odor that made their eyes water. Suddenly, they saw it, a massive dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, staring at them with glowing yellow eyes. The creature was covered in thick, matted hair, and it stood at least 9 feet tall. For a moment, the 2 men were frozen in place, too shocked to move. Then, without warning, the creature let out a bone-chilling scream that echoed through the forest. It charged toward them, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for something so large. Mike and Tom turned and ran, firing their rifles blindly behind them in a desperate attempt to slow it down. They didn't stop running until they reached their campsite, where they quickly packed up their gear and fled the forest. To this day, neither of them can explain what they saw that night, but they both agree on one thing: they came face to face with Bigfoot, and they were lucky to escape with their lives. The mysterious disappearance. In the summer of 1973, a small logging town in Oregon was rocked by the mysterious disappearance of a local family. The Thompsons had lived in the area for generations and were well known in the community. One evening, they set out on a weekend camping trip in the nearby woods and were never seen again. When the family failed to return, a search party was organized. They found the Thompsons' campsite abandoned, with no sign of a struggle, but there was an overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened. The tents were intact, the campfire was cold, and all their belongings were left behind, but there was one disturbing clue: giant, human-like footprints surrounding the campsite. The search party combed the area for days but found no trace of the family. Local authorities eventually called off the search, labeling the case as an unsolved mystery. But those who had been involved in the search were convinced that something inhuman had taken the Thompsons, something that had been lurking in the woods for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. The town never recovered from the loss, and the story of the Thompson family's disappearance became a dark legend that still haunts the area to this day. Some say that the forest is cursed, and that those who venture too deep into its shadows may never return. The Lost Hunters of Mount Street Helens. In the shadow of Mount Street Helens, an area known for its volcanic activity and remote wilderness, two hunters, Jack and Rick, set out on a hunting expedition in the fall of 1979. The rugged terrain was challenging, but the two men were seasoned outdoorsmen, familiar with the dangers of the wild. However, nothing could have prepared them for what they would encounter in the dense, fog-laden forests surrounding the mountain. The men had been out for several days, tracking deer and elk, when they began to notice something unusual. Trees appeared to be broken off at unusual heights, far beyond the reach of any known animal in the area. There were also strange, large footprints in the mud, leading deeper into the forest. Jack, who had heard stories of Bigfoot sightings in the region, joked about it, but Rick was less amused. He felt an uneasy presence, as if they were being watched by something hidden among the trees. Their unease grew when, one night, they were awakened by the sound of something heavy moving around their campsite. The creature made no effort to be stealthy. Branches snapped, and the earth trembled beneath its weight. The men quickly grabbed their rifles, but when they stepped out of their tent, they saw nothing. The forest was eerily silent, save for the distant sound of a waterfall. The next morning, they decided to pack up and head back to civilization, but as they prepared to leave, they found their gear had been disturbed. Their food supplies were gone, and strange symbols had been carved into the ground around their tent, resembling ancient runes or warnings. Rick was visibly shaken, insisting they leave immediately. As they trekked through the dense forest, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Then, without warning, they heard a low, guttural growl followed by a deafening roar. They turned to see a massive figure emerging from the trees, its eyes glowing a fierce red. The creature was unlike anything they had ever seen, towering at least 10 feet tall, covered in thick, dark hair, and with a face that was both human and animal. Panicking, the men fired their rifles, but the creature seemed unfazed. It charged at them with a speed that defied its size. Jack and Rick ran for their lives, stumbling through the underbrush, the creature hot on their heels. They ran until they could no longer hear the beast behind them, collapsing from exhaustion once they reached a clearing. They never spoke of the encounter again, but both men were changed by the experience. Jack refused to go hunting ever again, while Rick moved away from the area, haunted by nightmares of the creature that had chased them through the forests of Mount Street Helens. To this day, some locals believe that the volcanic eruption in 1980 wasn't the only force of nature lurking on that mountain. The Midnight Stalker of Appalachia. The Appalachian Mountains are home to some of the most remote and rugged landscapes in the United States. For centuries, tales of mysterious creatures have circulated among the mountain communities, passed down through generations. Among these stories is the legend of the Midnight Stalker, a Bigfoot-like creature that is said to roam the dense forests of Appalachia, striking fear into the hearts of those who encounter it. In the winter of 1985, a small logging crew set up camp deep in the Appalachian wilderness, far from any signs of civilization. The men were seasoned workers, accustomed to the hardships of life in the forest. However, they were not prepared for what they would face that fateful winter. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of the men, Joe, failed to return from checking on a nearby logging site. The crew searched for him, but all they found were his footprints in the snow, leading to a dense thicket, and then nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The crew was spooked, but they had a job to do, so they continued their work. However, strange things began happening around the camp. They heard eerie howls at night, distant but unmistakably unnatural. Tools went missing, only to be found later, twisted and broken as if by some immense force. Then, one night, the creature showed itself. The men were gathered around the fire when they heard the now familiar howl, much closer this time. The ground shook as something massive approached their camp. Out of the shadows stepped a huge figure, its eyes glowing in the firelight. The creature was unlike any animal they had ever seen, with long matted hair and an overpowering stench that made them gag. The men froze in terror as the creature let out a deafening roar. It seemed to be sizing them up, as if deciding whether they were a threat. One of the men, Bill, grabbed an axe and swung it at the creature in desperation, but it only enraged the beast. With a single swipe, the creature sent Bill flying into a nearby tree, knocking him unconscious. The rest of the crew scattered, running into the woods in different directions. They spent the night hiding, too terrified to move, listening as the creature roamed the camp, destroying everything in its path. By morning, the creature was gone, but the camp was in ruins. Bill had survived but was badly injured, and the others were shaken to their core. The logging operation was abandoned, and the men returned to town with their harrowing tale. The locals were not surprised. Many had their own stories of encounters with the midnight stalker, a creature they believed was as old as the mountains themselves. The legend lives on, a dark shadow over the Appalachian wilderness, where the brave or foolish might still encounter the beast that stalks the night. The Forest Watcher of British Columbia. The vast wilderness of British Columbia is known for its breathtaking beauty and rugged landscapes, but it also harbors secrets that have puzzled and terrified those who dare to explore its depths. Among the most chilling of these secrets is the legend of the Forest Watcher, a Bigfoot that is said to guard the ancient forests, ensuring that intruders do not disturb the natural order. In the summer of 1993, a group of hikers set out to explore a remote area of British Columbia known for its old-growth forests and pristine lakes. The group, consisting of 4 experienced outdoor enthusiasts, was well prepared for the journey. They had heard the local legends but dismissed them as mere folklore until they encountered the Forest Watcher. The hike started off uneventful, with the group enjoying the stunning scenery and the sense of isolation that came with being so far from civilization. However, as they ventured deeper into the forest, they began to notice strange things. Trees had been stripped of their bark, as if something had clawed at them with immense force. The ground was littered with large, human-like footprints, far too big to belong to any person. One evening, as they were setting up camp near a crystal-clear lake, they noticed a figure standing on the opposite shore. At first, they thought it was another hiker, but as they watched, the figure moved in a way that was distinctly inhuman. Its gait was awkward, almost loping, and it seemed to be covered in dark matted fur. The figure disappeared into the trees, but the group felt uneasy. That night, they were awakened by strange noises, a deep, rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to come from all around them. The air was thick with tension, and the usual sounds of the forest were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The group members were paralyzed with fear, listening as the growl grew closer until it was right outside their tent. The creature made no attempt to enter the tent, but its presence was undeniable. They could hear its heavy breathing, its footsteps circling them like a predator sizing up its prey. The group stayed huddled in their tent until dawn, too terrified to move. When they finally emerged, they found their camp had been disturbed, food was missing, and their gear had been rummaged through. The large footprints were everywhere, circling their campsite as if the creature had been watching them all night. Shaken, the group decided to cut their trip short and return to civilization. As they made their way back through the forest, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every so often, they would catch a glimpse of the Forest Watcher between the trees, always at a distance but always there, observing them. When they finally reached the trailhead, they reported their encounter to the local authorities, but their story was met with skepticism. However, the locals knew better. Stories of the forest watcher had been passed down for generations, and the hiker's encounter only added to the legend. To this day, those who venture into the remote forests of British Columbia are warned to respect the land and its ancient guardian. For those who do not, the forest watcher may appear, reminding them that the wilderness is not a place for the faint of heart. The mysterious lights of the Oregon wilderness. The forests of Oregon are vast and filled with natural beauty, but they also hide secrets that defy explanation. Among these mysteries are the reports of strange, glowing lights that have been seen deep in the wilderness, often in conjunction with Bigfoot sightings. These lights have puzzled scientists and frightened those who have encountered them, leading to speculation that they may be connected to the elusive creature. In the spring of 2007, a group of college students decided to spend a weekend camping in a remote area of Oregon known for its rugged terrain and dense forests. They were eager to escape the pressures of school and enjoy the peace and quiet of the wilderness. However, what they encountered would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the world. The first night was uneventful, with the group enjoying a campfire and swapping stories. But as the night wore on, they noticed strange lights flickering in the distance, deep in the forest. The lights were unlike anything they had ever seen, glowing, orb-like shapes that seemed to move with a purpose, weaving between the trees. Curious, the group decided to investigate, thinking it might be a group of other campers, or perhaps some kind of natural phenomenon. They grabbed their flashlights and ventured into the woods, following the lights as they moved deeper into the forest. But the closer they got, the more uneasy they felt. The lights seemed to be leading them somewhere, but to what end, they couldn't be sure. As they walked, they began to hear strange noises, low growls, rustling in the bushes, and the distant sound of heavy footsteps. The lights began to move faster, almost as if they were trying to lure the group deeper into the woods. Then, without warning, the lights vanished, leaving the group in total darkness. Panic set in as the students realized they were lost, with no clear way back to their campsite. The sounds of the forest grew louder, more menacing, and they could feel the presence of something watching them. Then they saw it, a massive figure standing just beyond the reach of their flashlights. It was Bigfoot towering over them, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light they had been following. The creature let out a deafening roar, sending the group running in all directions. They scrambled through the forest, desperate to find their way back to camp. The creature seemed to be everywhere, its heavy footsteps echoing through the trees as it pursued them. After what felt like hours, the group finally stumbled back to their campsite, shaken and exhausted. The creature had not followed them back, but the memory of its glowing eyes and the strange lights that had led them into the woods would haunt them for years to come. The students returned to civilization the next day, their weekend getaway forever mad by the encounter. They shared their story with friends and family, but most dismissed it as a hallucination or an elaborate prank. However, those who had spent time in the Oregon wilderness knew better. The lights were real, and they were connected to something far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The haunting of the northern woods. The northern woods of Minnesota are a place of quiet beauty, where the towering pines and crystal-clear lakes create a landscape that seems untouched by time. But beneath this serene exterior lies a dark and unsettling secret, a Bigfoot creature that is said to haunt the forests, appearing to those who dare to venture too deep into its territory. In the summer of 1991, a park ranger named Tom was assigned to a remote area of the northern woods, tasked with monitoring the wildlife and ensuring the safety of visitors. Tom was an experienced ranger, familiar with the land and its inhabitants, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would encounter during his time in the woods. It started with strange reports from campers and hikers, unexplained noises at night, food supplies going missing, and sightings of a large hairy creature lurking in the shadows. Tom initially dismissed the reports as exaggerated or the result of overactive imaginations, but as the sightings became more frequent, he decided to investigate. One evening, Tom set out to patrol the area where the most sightings had been reported. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees as he made his way deeper into the forest. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. As he walked, Tom noticed something unusual: large, human-like footprints in the mud, leading away from the main trail and into a dense thicket. Curious, he followed the tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The tracks led him to a small clearing where he saw it, a massive figure standing at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. The creature was unlike anything Tom had ever seen. It was at least 9 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its hair was dark and matted, and its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light. The creature stared at him for a moment, as if deciding whether to approach or retreat. Then, without warning, the creature let out a low growl and stepped forward. Tom's instincts took over, and he backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the creature as it moved closer. The tension in the air was palpable, and Tom could feel his heart racing as he realized just how dangerous the situation was. Suddenly, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if listening to something in the distance. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Tom alone in the clearing. Shaken, Tom hurried back to his truck and drove back to the ranger station, his mind racing with what he had just witnessed. Over the next few weeks, the sightings continued, but the creature never showed itself to Tom again. However, the reports from campers and hikers grew more alarming. Some claimed to have seen the creature standing outside their tents at night, while others reported hearing its low growls echoing through the woods. Tom eventually requested a transfer to a different park, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him since his encounter with the creature. The northern woods, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. To this day, the legend of the Bigfoot that haunts the northern woods persists, a chilling reminder that there are still mysteries in the world that defy explanation. Those who venture into the depths of the forest are warned to be cautious, for the creature that lurks in the shadows may be watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The disappearance at Crater Lake. In the late summer of 1989, a young couple, Mark and Emily, set out for a weekend getaway at Crater Lake in Oregon. The lake, formed by a collapsed volcano, is one of the deepest and most mysterious bodies of water in the United States, surrounded by dense forests that seem to stretch on forever. The couple was looking forward to a peaceful escape, but what they found was something far more sinister. On their second day, Mark and Emily decided to hike a remote trail that circled the lake. The trail was known for its breathtaking views, but was also notorious for its isolation. As they hiked, they noticed the forest growing darker and more oppressive. The usual sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to swallow up all sound. As they reached a secluded part of the trail, Emily noticed something strange, a large, shadowy figure moving among the trees. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but when she pointed it out to Mark, he saw it too. The figure was massive, standing at least 9 feet tall, and seemed to be watching them from a distance. Nervously, the couple continued their hike, quickening their pace, but the figure seemed to follow them, always staying just out of sight, yet close enough to let them know it was there. The tension in the air was palpable, and both Mark and Emily could feel their hearts racing with fear. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they came to a clearing with a small, abandoned cabin. Desperate to find safety, they decided to take shelter there. The cabin was old and dilapidated, with broken windows and a rotting door, but it offered some semblance of protection. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by a foul, musky odor that made their stomachs churn. Suddenly, they heard it, a deep, guttural growl coming from outside the cabin. The sound was so low and menacing that it seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. Mark and Emily froze in place, too terrified to move. The growling grew louder, and then they heard heavy footsteps, slowly circling the cabin. The creature was outside, and it was getting closer. Mark grabbed an old, rusty hunting knife that he found on a shelf and positioned himself near the door, ready to defend them if necessary. But deep down, he knew that if the creature wanted to get in, the flimsy door wouldn't stop it. For what felt like hours, the couple huddled together in the darkness, listening to the creature's movements outside. At one point, they heard it scratching at the door, testing it as if deciding whether to break it down. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature retreated into the forest, leaving Mark and Emily in terrified silence. When they finally felt it was safe to leave, they cautiously stepped outside, only to find the forest eerily silent once again. There were no signs of the creature, but large, human-like footprints were imprinted in the soft earth around the cabin. They never spoke of the encounter again, and they left Crater Lake that very day, vowing never to return. The memory of those terrifying hours in the abandoned cabin would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a reminder of the unknown dangers lurking in the wilderness. The phantom howls of the Smoky Mountains. The Great Smoky Mountains are known for their mist-covered peaks and ancient forests, a place where the past seems to linger in the air. But the mountains are also home to something far more terrifying, Bigfoot, a creature that has been the subject of local legends for centuries. For the residents of the small mountain towns, the stories are more than just folklore, they are warnings passed down through generations. In the spring of 2003, a group of college friends decided to go camping in a remote area of the Smoky Mountains, far from the well-trodden tourist trails. The group, consisting of 5 young men and women, were excited for the adventure and the chance to explore the wild, untouched beauty of the mountains. The campsite was set up near a small stream, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The first night was peaceful, with the group enjoying a campfire and the sound of the stream gurgling nearby. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere changed. Around midnight, they began to hear strange, echoing howls coming from the depths of the forest. The howls were unlike anything they had ever heard, long, mournful, and filled with a sense of primal fear. The sound reverberated through the trees, sending chills down their spines. At first, they tried to dismiss the sounds as just the cries of a distant wolf or coyote, but the howls grew louder and more frequent, moving closer to their campsite. The group huddled together, their nerves on edge, as the howls seemed to surround them, coming from all directions. Then, the forest fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was even more unsettling, and the friends could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. They could sense that something was watching them, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Suddenly, the howling resumed, louder and more intense than before. The group grabbed their flashlights and shone them into the forest, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. For a moment, they saw nothing but darkness and trees. But then, out of the corner of their eyes, they saw it, a massive, shadowy figure moving between the trees. The creature was enormous, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light that sent waves of fear through the group. It moved with a fluid grace, its long arms swinging as it walked, and its howls pierced the night air with a terrifying intensity. Panic set in, and the group decided to abandon their campsite. They grabbed what they could carry and began to make their way back to their cars, but the creature followed them, its howls growing louder and more desperate. It was as if the creature was trying to drive them out of its territory, warning them to leave before it was too late. The hike back to their cars was a nightmare, with the creature always just behind them, its howls echoing through the trees. The friends ran as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests, until they finally reached the safety of their vehicles. They drove away as fast as they could, leaving the Smoky Mountains and their terrifying encounter behind. The experience left them shaken, and they vowed never to speak of it again. But the memory of those phantom howls and the creature that stalked them in the darkness would haunt them for years to come. The Wendigo of the Northwoods. In the remote wilderness of Minnesota's Northwoods, where the winters are harsh and the forests seem endless, there are stories of a creature that is feared by both Native American tribes and modern-day residents alike. This creature, often referred to as the Wendigo, is said to be a malevolent spirit that takes the form of a Bigfoot-like monster, stalking those who venture too deep into the forest. In the winter of 1995, a group of 3 snowmobilers set out to explore the frozen lakes and snow-covered forests of northern Minnesota. The group, consisting of 2 men and a woman, was experienced with winter sports and well prepared for the cold, but they were not prepared for what they would encounter in the depths of the Northwoods. The first day of their trip was uneventful, with the group enjoying the thrill of speeding across the frozen lakes and through the snowy forests. But as night fell and they set up camp in a remote area, they began to notice strange things. The wind seemed to carry whispers, eerie and unintelligible, as if the forest itself was speaking to them. The temperature dropped rapidly, and an unnatural stillness settled over the land. As they huddled around their campfire, they heard it, a distant, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. The scream was unlike anything they had ever heard, filled with a deep, primal terror that chilled them to the bone. The group looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Then they saw it, standing on the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light of the campfire, was a massive creature. It was covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light. The creature let out another scream, this time closer and more menacing, and the group knew they were in grave danger. The woman, Sarah, was the first to react. She grabbed her snowmobile keys and urged the others to do the same. They quickly packed up what they could and started their engines, the sound of the machines cutting through the oppressive silence. But as they sped away, the creature gave chase. The snowmobiles raced through the forest, weaving between trees and over snowdrifts, but the creature was relentless. It moved with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for something so large, and its screams echoed through the night, growing closer with each passing moment. The group could feel the creature gaining on them, its presence a looming shadow just out of sight. Then, suddenly, one of the snowmobiles sputtered and stalled. The man riding it, Tom, was thrown into the snow as the machine came to a sudden stop. The others skidded to a halt, their hearts pounding with fear. Tom scrambled to his feet, but the creature was already upon him. It let out a final, deafening scream as it lunged at him, its massive claws outstretched. But just as it seemed Tom was doomed, the creature stopped short, as if an invisible barrier had been placed between them. It snarled in frustration, its red eyes burning with fury, before turning and disappearing into the darkness. The group quickly helped Tom back onto his snowmobile, and they sped away, not stopping until they reached the safety of a small cabin they had passed earlier in the day. They spent the night there, too terrified to venture back out into the wilderness. The next morning, they returned to civilization, their encounter with the Wendigo etched into their minds. They never spoke of what had happened, fearing that no one would believe them. But the memory of that night, and the creature that stalked them through the frozen forests, would remain with them forever. The shadow in the redwood forest. The towering redwood forests of Northern California are a place of awe and wonder, where ancient trees stretch hundreds of feet into the sky and the forest floor is shrouded in perpetual twilight. But for all its beauty, the redwoods are also home to one of the most terrifying legends in Bigfoot lore, a creature that is said to be even larger and more fearsome than its counterparts, lurking in the shadows of the ancient trees. In the summer of 2012, a father and son set out on a backpacking trip through the redwoods, eager to experience the majesty of the ancient forest. The father, Jim, was a seasoned outdoorsman, and he wanted to share his love of nature with his son, Mike, who had just turned 16. The trip was meant to be a bonding experience, a chance for the two to connect in the solitude of the wilderness. The first few days of the trip were uneventful, with the pair marveling at the sheer size of the trees and the peacefulness of the forest. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, they began to feel a sense of unease. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing so tall and dense that they blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in shadow. One evening, as they were setting up camp, Mike noticed something strange. A large, dark shape moving among the trees. He pointed it out to his father, who dismissed it as a trick of the light or perhaps a deer. But as the evening wore on, the sense of unease grew stronger, and both Jim and Mike began to feel as if they were being watched. That night, as they lay in their tent, they heard strange noises coming from the forest. There were the usual sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, but underneath it all was something else. A low, rhythmic thumping sound, like something heavy walking through the forest, and the occasional snap of a branch, as if something was moving closer. Jim tried to reassure his son, but he too felt the growing tension. He kept his hunting knife close at hand, just in case. But as the hours passed and the noises grew louder, they both knew something was out there, something big. Then, just after midnight, the forest went silent. The sudden absence of sound was deafening, and both Jim and Mike lay still, straining to hear anything. That's when they heard it, a deep, guttural growl, coming from just outside their tent. The growl was so low and menacing that it seemed to vibrate through the ground, filling them with a primal fear. Jim slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside, but all he saw was darkness. The growl came again, this time closer, and he could see a large, shadowy figure moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. The creature was massive, standing at least 10 feet tall, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to burn through the darkness. Panicking, Jim grabbed his flashlight and shone it at the creature, but it only seemed to anger it. The creature let out a deafening roar and lunged at the tent, causing the entire structure to collapse. Jim and Mike scrambled out, barely escaping as the creature tore through their campsite, scattering their gear and snapping branches like twigs. The two ran as fast as they could through the dark forest, not stopping until they reached a nearby ranger station at dawn. Exhausted and terrified, they recounted their encounter to the rangers, but their story was met with skepticism. The rangers searched the area but found no trace of the creature, only the remains of the destroyed campsite and large, human-like footprints in the dirt. Jim and Mike returned home, their trip to the redwoods forever marred by the encounter. They never went back to the forest, and the memory of that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The legend of the Bigfoot that haunts the redwoods remains, a dark and terrifying mystery that continues to draw both skeptics and believers alike to the ancient forest. The Forgotten Mine of the Rockies. High in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, where the peaks are jagged and the valleys deep, lies an old, abandoned mine, long forgotten by time. The mine, once the site of a booming gold rush, is now a place of darkness and decay, its tunnels echoing with the whispers of those who came seeking fortune and found only despair. But the mine is also said to be the home of a Bigfoot creature, a guardian of the mountain who fiercely protects its territory. In the fall of 1977, a group of treasure hunters, drawn by rumors of a hidden gold vein, set out to explore the abandoned mine. The group, consisting of 3 men and 2 women, was well equipped with gear and supplies, determined to find the lost treasure that had eluded so many before them. The journey to the mine was treacherous, with the group navigating steep cliffs and narrow paths that wound through the mountains. The mine itself was hidden in a remote valley, accessible only by a series of dark, winding tunnels that snaked deep into the heart of the mountain. As they ventured into the mine, the group was struck by the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. The walls were lined with ancient timbers, rotting and crumbling with age, and the floors were slick with moisture and debris. But what unnerved them most were the strange, claw-like marks that scored the walls, as if something had been digging through the rock with immense strength. Undeterred, the group pressed on, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way deeper into the mine. But as they descended further, they began to hear strange noises, soft, shuffling sounds that seemed to come from all around them, and the distant echo of something large moving through the tunnels. Then they heard a loud crash, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. The sound echoed through the tunnels, growing louder and more menacing. The group froze, their hearts pounding with fear as they realized they were not alone in the mine. Suddenly, the ground began to shake, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to close in around them. The growling grew louder, and then they saw it, a massive figure, half hidden in the shadows, charging toward them. The creature was unlike anything they had ever seen, covered in thick, matted fur, with long, powerful arms and glowing red eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural fire. Panic set in, and the group turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the tunnels as they fled from the creature. The mine was a labyrinth, and in their terror, they quickly became disoriented, stumbling through the darkness as the creature pursued them. One by one, they became separated, lost in the twisting tunnels, their screams echoing through the mine as the creature closed in on them. The last man, John, was the only one to make it out alive. He stumbled out of the mine at dawn, covered in dirt and blood, his mind shattered by the horrors he had witnessed. John never spoke of what happened in the mine, but the story spread, and the legend of the Bigfoot that haunts the forgotten tunnels of the Rocky Mountains grew. To this day, the mine remains abandoned, a place of darkness and fear, where few dare to venture. The treasure hunters who entered the mine in search of gold found only death, and the creature that guards the mountain continues to watch over its territory, a silent sentinel of the ancient peaks. The Haunted Cabins of Skamania County. In the heart of Skamania County, Washington, nestled deep within the dense forests of the Cascade Mountains, lies a cluster of old, abandoned cabins. These cabins were once part of a thriving logging community, but after a series of mysterious disappearances and gruesome deaths in the 1960s, they were left to rot, becoming the subject of local legends. Locals believe that the area is cursed, haunted by a Bigfoot that is far more dangerous than any other. In the summer of 2015, a group of paranormal investigators decided to spend a week in one of these cabins, eager to uncover the truth behind the chilling stories. The group, composed of 5 investigators, was equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and all the latest technology for detecting paranormal activity. They were skeptical of the Bigfoot stories, believing them to be nothing more than superstition. But what they found was far more terrifying than any ghost. The first few nights were quiet, with the group experiencing nothing out of the ordinary. However, on the 3rd night, strange things began to happen. It started with faint noises outside the cabin, distant howls, the crack of branches, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the forest. The investigators, thinking it might be an animal, set up their cameras and waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. As the night wore on, the noises grew louder and more frequent, and a sense of unease settled over the group. The air became thick and oppressive, and the usual sounds of the forest were replaced by an eerie silence. Then, just after midnight, they heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. One of the investigators, Sarah, cautiously opened the door and shone her flashlight into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but trees and shadows, but then she caught sight of it, a massive, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The figure was at least 10 feet tall, covered in thick, matted hair, and it was watching them with a menacing intensity. Sarah gasped and stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut. The others rushed to her side, and she quickly described what she had seen. The group, now on high alert, turned off the lights and watched the monitors, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature on camera. But what they saw was far worse. The cameras outside the cabin picked up something moving in the shadows, large, hulking shapes that seemed to dart between the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The creatures appeared to be circling the cabin, closing in with each pass. The investigators were trapped, with no way out and no way to defend themselves. Then the growling started again, louder this time, and the cabin began to shake, as if something was pounding on the walls. The group huddled together, terrified, as the creatures outside became more aggressive, their roars echoing through the night. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered, and a large hairy arm reached inside, swiping at the investigators. They screamed and scattered, trying to avoid the creature's grasp. One of the men, Tom, was caught by the arm and dragged toward the window, but the others managed to pull him back just in time. They barricaded the window with whatever they could find, but the creatures outside were relentless. The night was a blur of terror and chaos, with the investigators fighting to keep the creatures out. At one point, the door nearly gave way as something massive slammed into it repeatedly. But just before dawn, the creatures suddenly retreated, disappearing into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. When daylight finally broke, the group emerged from the cabin, shaken and exhausted. The forest was eerily silent, and there was no sign of the creatures. But the damage to the cabin was undeniable: broken windows, claw marks on the walls, and large footprints surrounding the building. The investigators packed up their equipment and left Skamania County, vowing never to return. The footage they captured was later analyzed, but nothing could explain the terrifying events they had experienced. The cabins remain abandoned, a place of fear and darkness where few dare to venture. The Ghost Road of Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey have long been associated with eerie tales and strange occurrences, from ghostly apparitions to sightings of the Jersey Devil. But among the dense, tangled woods lies a stretch of road that is said to be haunted by something far more physical, a Bigfoot that stalks those who travel its lonely path at night. In the fall of 1982, a young couple, Amy and Dave, decided to take a late-night drive through the Pine Barrens. The night was clear, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the road. They had heard the stories of strange happenings in the Barrens, but they were skeptical, believing them to be nothing more than local folklore. As they drove deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew heavier, and a sense of unease settled over them. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization in sight. The dense forest pressed in on both sides, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, without warning, the car's headlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The engine sputtered and stalled, leaving them stranded in the middle of the road. Dave tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The engine was dead. As they sat in the darkness trying to figure out what to do, they heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the woods. The sound was deep and menacing, and it seemed to vibrate through the air, filling them with a primal fear. Amy gripped Dave's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. The growl grew louder, and then they saw it, two glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness just beyond the edge of the road. The eyes were set high off the ground, at least 10 feet up, and they moved with a slow, deliberate motion as the creature stepped out of the woods and onto the road. The creature was massive, covered in thick, dark fur, and it stood on two legs like a man, but it was far too large and powerful to be human. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its breath steamed in the cool night air. The creature let out another growl, and the couple could feel the vibrations in their bones. Dave quickly locked the doors and fumbled for the keys, desperately trying to start the car. But the creature began to move closer, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. It reached the car and peered inside, its glowing eyes scanning the interior. Amy and Dave sat frozen in terror, too afraid to move. The creature circled the car, its claws scraping against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the paint. It seemed to be testing the vehicle, as if deciding whether to attack. Andy could feel tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature let out a deafening roar and retreated into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The couple sat in stunned silence, their hearts racing, until Dave finally managed to start the car. They sped away, not daring to look back. The image of the creature's glowing eyes burned into their minds. The experience left them shaken, and they never spoke of it again, fearing that no one would believe them. But the memory of that night, and the creature that stalked them on the ghost road of Pine Barrens, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The road remains a place of fear and mystery, where those who venture too far may come face to face with the unknown. The Beast of Boggy Creek. In the swampy backwoods of Firk, Arkansas, lies Boggy Creek, a place where the water runs thick and the trees grow twisted and gnarled. For decades, the area has been plagued by reports of a Bigfoot-like creature known locally as the Fook monster that terrorizes anyone who dares to enter its domain. The legend of the Beast of Boggy Creek has been passed down through generations, but for some, it is more than just a story. In the spring of 1973, a group of friends decided to take a weekend trip to Boggy Creek for some fishing and camping. The group, consisting of 4 men, had grown up hearing the stories of the Fook monster, but they laughed them off as nothing more than tall tales. They were eager to spend a few days in the wild, away from the stresses of daily life. The first day of their trip was uneventful, with the group enjoying the peacefulness of the swamp and the thrill of catching fish in the murky waters. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The usual sounds of the swamp, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, were replaced by an eerie silence, as if the entire area was holding its breath. The men set up camp on a small, dry patch of land near the water's edge and built a fire to keep warm. As they sat around the fire, swapping stories and drinking beer, they heard a strange noise in the distance. It was a low, guttural moan, unlike anything they had ever heard. The sound echoed through the trees, sending chills down their spines. One of the men, Bill, stood up and shone his flashlight into the darkness, trying to see what had made the noise. But the beam of light only revealed more trees and shadows. The moaning sound came again, closer this time, and the men exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly, the bushes behind them rustled, and they heard heavy footsteps approaching the camp. The men grabbed their rifles, their hearts pounding with fear, as they watched the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, out of the shadows, it appeared, a massive, hairy creature, standing upright on 2 legs, its eyes glowing with a fierce red light. The creature was enormous, standing at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its fur was dark and matted, and its face was a grotesque mixture of human and animal features. The Fook monster had found them, and it was not pleased. The creature let out a deafening roar, causing the men to stumble back in fear. It advanced toward them, its massive hands reaching out as if to grab them. The men fired their rifles, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature only roared louder, its eyes burning with anger. In a panic, the men scrambled to grab their gear and flee. They ran through the swamp, their boots sinking into the mud as the creature chased after them. The swamp seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap them. Finally, they reached the safety of their truck, breathless and terrified. The creature stopped at the edge of the swamp, its glowing eyes watching them as they sped away, the sound of its roars echoing in their ears. The men returned to Fook, shaken and traumatized by their encounter. They shared their story with the locals, who nodded knowingly. Another group of men had come face to face with the beast of Boggy Creek, and they were lucky to have escaped with their lives. The legend of the Fook monster continues to haunt the swamps of Boggy Creek, a reminder that some places are not meant to be explored. The creature remains a mystery, its true nature unknown, but those who have seen it know that it is real, and it is not to be trifled with. The Stalker of the Adirondacks. The Adirondack Mountains of New York are a place of stunning natural beauty, with their rugged peaks and pristine lakes attracting hikers, campers, and nature lovers from all over the world. But the Adirondacks are also home to something far more sinister, a Bigfoot creature that is said to stalk the forests, watching those who venture too deep into its territory. In the fall of 1999, a father and his teenage daughter decided to go on a camping trip in the Adirondacks, hoping to bond over their shared love of the outdoors. The father, a seasoned hiker named Jim, had been coming to the mountains for years, and he wanted to share the experience with his daughter Lily. The first few days of the trip were perfect, with the pair enjoying the crisp autumn air and the vibrant colors of the changing leaves. They hiked during the day and spent their evenings around the campfire, talking and laughing under the stars. But on the fourth day, things began to take a dark turn. As they hiked along a remote trail, they began to notice strange things. A feeling of being watched, the occasional sound of something large moving through the trees, and the unsettling silence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Jim dismissed it as nerves, but Lily was growing increasingly uneasy. That night, as they lay in their tent, they'd heard something moving outside. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. Jim grabbed his flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent, peering outside. But all he saw was darkness. The footsteps continued, circling the campsite, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and both Jim and Lily held their breath, straining to hear anything. Then they heard it, a low guttural growl, coming from just outside the tent. Jim shone his flashlight in the direction of the sound, and there it was, a massive figure, standing just beyond the edge of the light. The creature was at least 9 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down almost to the ground. Its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light, and its breath steamed in the cool night air. The creature stood still for a moment, watching them, before letting out a deep, menacing growl that sent chills down their spines. It took a step forward, and Jim could see the muscles rippling under its fur, its massive hands clenching into fists. Panicking, Jim grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her out of the tent. They ran through the forest, the creature's footsteps thundering behind them. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the darkness was so thick that it was almost impossible to see where they were going. Finally, they reached a small clearing and stopped to catch their breath. The creature had stopped chasing them. They could still feel its presence, lurking in the shadows. They didn't dare move, fearing that any sound would bring it back. The night passed in a blur of terror, with the creature occasionally making its presence known with a low growl or the snap of a branch. But it never came into the clearing, and by morning it was gone. Jim and Lily quickly packed up their gear and left the Adirondacks, too shaken to continue their trip. The experience left them traumatized, and they never returned to the mountains. The Adirondacks remain a place of beauty and mystery, but for those who have encountered the stalker of the Adirondacks, they are also a place of fear. The Curse of the Black Hills. The Black Hills of South Dakota are a place of ancient legends where the spirits of the land are said to watch over the living. The hills are sacred to the Lakota Sioux, who have long believed that a powerful spirit, often taking the form of a Bigfoot, protects the land from those who would desecrate it. For those who do not heed the warnings, the Curse of the Black Hills can be deadly. In the summer of 1978, a group of archaeologists set out to explore a remote area of the Black Hills, searching for ancient Native American artifacts. The group, led by Dr. Richard Hayes, was eager to uncover the secrets of the past, but they were warned by the local Lakota to stay away from certain areas, which were considered sacred. Ignoring the warnings, the group pressed on, confident in their mission. The first few days of the expedition were uneventful, with the group uncovering a few minor artifacts, but nothing of great significance. However, as they ventured deeper into the hills, they began to experience strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctioned, tools went missing, and the weather turned suddenly and inexplicably bad, with violent storms that seemed to come out of nowhere. One evening, as the group was setting up camp, they noticed strange symbols carved into the trees around them, ancient runes that none of them could identify. Dr. Hayes dismissed them as a coincidence, but the others were growing increasingly uneasy. That night, as they sat around the campfire, they heard strange noises in the distance, low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from deep within the hills. The sound was unsettling, filling them with a sense of dread. Then they heard something else. A deep, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. Suddenly, the drumming stopped, and the air grew thick with tension. The group sat in silence, waiting for something to happen. Then, out of the darkness, they saw it, a massive figure standing at the edge of the firelight. The creature was at least 10 feet tall, with glowing red eyes and thick, matted fur. It stood on 2 legs, its massive hands clenched into fists as it watched them with a menacing intensity. Dr. Hayes stood up, trying to assert his authority, but the creature let out a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath them. The others scrambled to their feet, grabbing whatever they could to defend themselves. But the creature did not attack. It simply watched them, as if waiting for something. Then the creature began to move, circling the camp, its eyes never leaving the group. The tension was unbearable, and the group could feel the fear creeping into their bones. They knew they were in the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that did not belong to the world of the living. Finally, the creature stopped in front of Dr. Hayes, towering over him. It let out another roar, and the ground seemed to tremble with its power. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the group in stunned silence. The next morning, the group packed up and left the Black Hills, abandoning the expedition. They returned to civilization, shaken and traumatized by the experience. Dr. Hayes, once a confident and ambitious man, was never the same. He became withdrawn and paranoid, convinced that the curse of the Black Hills would follow him for the rest of his life. The Black Hills remain a place of mystery and power, where the spirits of the land watch over the living. For those who respect the land and its ancient guardians, the hills offer peace and solitude. But for those who ignore the warnings, the curse of the Black Hills awaits, a reminder that some places are not meant to be disturbed. The silent forest of Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta, with its snow-capped peak towering over Northern California, has long been a place of mystery and spiritual significance. For centuries, it has been a sacred site for Native American tribes, a place where the earth meets the sky and where ancient spirits are said to dwell. But the mountain is also home to something far more terrifying, a Bigfoot creature that has been the subject of countless sightings and stories. This is the tale of one such encounter, a story of fear and survival in the silent forests of Mount Shasta. In the summer of 2008, a young woman named Jessica decided to spend a few days camping alone on Mount Shasta. An experienced hiker and nature lover, she was looking forward to the solitude and peace that the mountain offered. She had heard of the legends of Bigfoot sightings in the area, but like many, she dismissed them as mere folklore. She was more interested in the mountain's beauty and the challenge of hiking its trails. Jessica set up her camp in a secluded spot near a small, crystal-clear lake, surrounded by towering pines and the rugged slopes of the mountain. The first day passed uneventfully, with Jessica exploring the area, taking photographs, and enjoying the tranquility of the wilderness. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As night fell, Jessica built a fire and settled in for the evening. The stars were bright in the sky, and the mountain was bathed in the soft glow of the moon. She felt at peace, completely alone in the vastness of nature. But as the night wore on, something changed. The usual sounds of the forest began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to envelop the entire area. The air grew colder, and Jessica felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The silence was broken by a low, distant rumble that seemed to come from deep within the forest. The sound was strange, like a combination of a growl and a moan, and it sent chills down Jessica's spine. She stood up, shining her flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The forest was still, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the night. Jessica tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just the wind or some distant animal. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. She decided to retreat to her tent, hoping that sleep would come and the unease would pass. But sleep did not come. As she lay in her sleeping bag, she heard it again, the low rumble, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, slowly approaching her camp. The footsteps were deliberate and measured, as if whatever was out there was taking its time, savoring the fear it was instilling in her. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to the footsteps drawing nearer. She held her breath, too terrified to move, her eyes wide open in the darkness. Then, just outside her tent, the footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the tent was hit by a powerful force, as if something had slammed into it. Jessica screamed, scrambling to get out of her sleeping bag, but the tent was knocked over, trapping her inside. She could hear the creature outside, its heavy breathing and low growls filling the air. Desperate, Jessica grabbed a knife she had brought with her and began cutting her way out of the tent. She emerged into the cold night, the knife clutched in her trembling hand. The fire had gone out, and the moonlight cast long shadows across the campsite. Then she saw it, a massive figure standing at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing in the darkness. The creature was enormous, standing at least 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, muscular arms. Its fur was dark and matted, and its face was a twisted, nightmarish blend of human and animal features. The creature stared at her, its eyes filled with a predatory intelligence. Jessica backed away slowly, her heart racing, but the creature took a step forward, its massive feet crunching on the dry leaves. She knew she couldn't outrun it, and there was nowhere to hide. The creature let out a deep, guttural growl, and Jessica could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath her. Just when she thought it was all over, the creature stopped. It tilted its head, as if listening to something in the distance. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Jessica stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then, adrenaline took over, and she quickly gathered what little she could carry and ran. She didn't stop running until she reached a ranger station at the base of the mountain, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind reeling from the encounter. She told the rangers what had happened, but they were skeptical, attributing her experience to stress and the isolation of the wilderness. However, one of the older rangers pulled her aside and told her quietly that she was not the first to report such a sighting on Mount Shasta. He advised her to leave the mountain and not to return alone. Jessica took his advice. She left Mount Shasta the next day and never went back. The encounter left her shaken, and she struggled for years to make sense of what she had seen. The experience changed her, turning her once fearless love of the wilderness into a cautious respect for the unknown. She knew that Mount Shasta was a place of beauty, but also a place of secrets, secrets that were better left undisturbed. The Watcher of the Yukon Wilderness. The remote, icy expanses of the Yukon Wilderness in northern Canada are a place where the rules of nature still reign supreme. This harsh, unforgiving landscape is home to some of the most rugged terrain on Earth, towering mountains, dense forests, and vast stretches of untouched wilderness. It's a place where few dare to venture, and those who do are often tested to their limits. But for those who have lived in these wild lands for generations, there's a story that's whispered around campfires and in the safety of log cabins. The story of the Watcher, a Bigfoot creature that roams the frozen forests, unseen but always present. In the winter of 1986, a trapper named Henry set out on a routine trip deep into the Yukon, where he maintained a line of traps. Henry was a seasoned outdoorsman, having spent most of his life in the wilderness. He was familiar with the land, the animals, and the unpredictable nature of the northern climate. The cold didn't bother him. He relished the solitude and the challenge of surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Henry's cabin was located miles from the nearest town, a small, sturdy structure that had withstood countless winters. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could rest and warm up after long days of checking his traps. He had heard the stories of the Watcher, but like many, he dismissed them as old wives' tales, superstitions meant to scare children or explain the unexplainable. But this winter would change his mind forever. The first sign that something was wrong came when Henry noticed that some of his traps had been disturbed. The snares were broken and the bait was gone, but there were no tracks leading to or from the traps, no signs of the usual predators like wolves or wolverines. The snow was pristine, untouched except for the area immediately around the traps. Perplexed but not yet alarmed, Henry reset the traps and continued his work. But over the next few days, the disturbances continued. More traps were found broken or missing, and still, there were no tracks, no sign of what was causing the damage. Henry began to feel uneasy, the sense that he was being watched creeping into his thoughts as he moved through the silent forest. Then, one evening, as he was returning to his cabin, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on him, of something lurking just out of sight. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his boots. He stopped, listening, but there was nothing. The trees stood tall and dark around him, their branches heavy with snow, casting long shadows in the dim light of the setting sun. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. A large, dark shape moving between the trees, almost too quick to see. Henry froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to see, but whatever it was had disappeared into the forest. Shaking off the fear, he hurried back to his cabin, telling himself it was just a bear or a moose, even though deep down he knew it was something else. That night, as the wind howled outside, Henry sat by the fire, his rifle close at hand. The feeling of being watched had not left him, and he found himself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at him from the darkness. The wind whipped against the cabin, rattling the windows and making the timbers creak, but inside it was warm and safe. Or so he thought. In the dead of night, Henry was jolted awake by a loud crash. He grabbed his rifle and jumped out of bed, his heart racing. The sound had come from outside, near the back of the cabin. Slowly he moved toward the door, every sense on high alert. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He opened the door cautiously and stepped outside, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The snow glowed faintly in the moonlight, casting long, cold shadows across the landscape. As he rounded the corner of the cabin, he saw it, a massive dark figure standing near the woodpile, its back turned to him. The creature was enormous, standing well over 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Its fur was thick and matted, and its breath steamed in the cold air. For a moment, Henry stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then, as if sensing his presence, the creature slowly turned to face him. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with the creature. Its face was a terrifying blend of human and animal features, deep-set eyes that glowed with an unnatural light, a flat nose, and a mouth that seemed capable of a cruel, predatory grin. But what struck Henry most was the intelligence in those eyes, a cold, calculating awareness that sent a wave of terror through him. Before he could react, the creature let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It took a step toward him, and Henry instinctively raised his rifle, his hands trembling. But the creature didn't attack. Instead, it simply stood there, watching him with those eerie, glowing eyes. Then, without warning, the creature turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with long, deliberate strides. Henry stood there for a long time, too stunned to move, the rifle still raised. Finally, he lowered the gun and retreated to the safety of his cabin, bolting the door behind him. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness, with every creak and groan of the cabin setting his nerves on edge. But the creature did not return. When dawn finally broke, Henry knew he had to leave. He packed up his gear and abandoned the cabin, making the long trek back to town as quickly as he could. When he finally reached civilization, he told his story to a few trusted friends, but most dismissed it as the product of isolation and fear. But Henry knew what he had seen. The Watcher of the Yukon wilderness was real, and it was something far more dangerous and intelligent than any animal he had ever encountered. He never returned to that cabin, leaving it to the elements and whatever else might be lurking in the forest. The Yukon wilderness remains a place of stark beauty and danger, where the line between myth and reality is blurred, and where the Watcher still roams, keeping a silent vigil over its territory.